much. So this is very much a talk of two parts. So I'm talking about, and you might have seen that from the abstract as well. So this is the Cornish Gothic, ostensibly, but you might have seen from my abstract, I was kind of torturing it into a new form at the same time. So this is research the Cornish Gothic stuff is research I've been doing now since 2014, which I realized with a shock of horror. And the other part of it, the kind of queer coasts part, kind of a queer Gothic ecologies part, that's brand new. So that's where I'm hoping to go. That's kind of my postdoctoral aims. And so you'll have part of this, which is such well-trodden territory for me. And I know there are some wonderful people in the room today who have heard this a million times, and I can only apologize, that I might not actually be very good at explaining it, because to me, it seems incredibly obvious that Cornwall is Gothic at this point. And then the other half of it, I'm also not going to be very good at explaining, because it's brand new and shiny. So you get to lose out as an audience in two different ways today. But I think it will hopefully lead to some really interesting and collaborative conversations. And I think it's also somewhat Gothic to have this vestige of my academic past, and then this kind of haunting spectre of my academic, hopefully, future. So I'm currently in the really wonderful and bizarre position of having my manuscript about to be flung into the Gothic void of the market. And I have an exclusive glimpse of the mock-up, which I'm not sure I can share, but screw it, it's my baby. So this is what it's going to look like. So this is my beautiful bouncing baby book. Not so tiny, actually. It's an absolute tome with some really kind blurbs from some very, very incredible scholars whose work I've respected so much for so very long. And with an image that I never thought I would get in a million years. If you're interested in working with UWP, please drop me an email if you'd like a chat. I can't recommend them highly enough. I can't believe they got this image. It was my bucket list dream, and they got it. They're the best team to work with. This has been a book that's been in production since like across the pandemic, and I can't recommend them highly enough. So this will be released on the 15th of June. It will be available in no good bookshops and at a price I can't afford. But if you would like to order it to your university libraries, if you're in the position to do so, I would be very, very grateful. And I think it can appeal to people beyond those interested in Cornwall. But also, I hope to convince you today that everyone should be interested in Cornwall, and Cornwall has a lot for all of us to think about, regardless of our specialism. So where did this all begin? Many, many millions of years ago. I'm not Cornish at all. I'm a Londoner. I'm a South East Londoner, and I didn't really live outside or go outside of London until I was 18, when I went to study at the University of Exeter Cornwall campus. And usually I wouldn't do this kind of like biographical tangent stuff, but as of this week, the University of Exeter Cornwall campus English department has closed. So I'm feeling incredibly nostalgic. It's been a victim of the national cuts that we're seeing that are targeting arts and humanities higher education departments around the country. And I've been thinking a lot about the experience I have there and how it has inevitably shaped this research. I'd never been to Cornwall. I didn't really know what a Cornwall was. And then I lived there. I had this fantastic opportunity to study in a county that I had little experience of, in a very, very tiny department where I was nurtured and nourished and made friends for life. So this is just a little thank you, Penryn, rest in peace, to open my talk with. And it took me a while to narrow down what it was about Cornwall that struck me when I arrived there. So I was bitter and twisted. I did not want to be in Cornwall. I was a Londoner. The world, it begins and ends in London as far as I was concerned when I was 18. I suddenly felt like I was in the middle of nowhere. My accommodation had surfboard racks. In my student house, seagulls would break in on a regular basis to smash up my kitchen and eat bananas. It was a very strange and disorientating experience. And I think inevitably that feeling of strangeness and disorientation fed my interest in the Gothic, which I've been nurturing for a number of years. It helped that I had all my lectures and seminars in the Daphne du Maurier building. It definitely helped that I was doing a third year Gothic unit with Nick Groon. So when I asked Nick, is there any Cornish Gothic before Daphne du Maurier? And he said, no, he doomed himself to be my PhD supervisor for 4 years. And for that, I am incredibly grateful. So when I finally started getting to research this, what I wanted to know is what is specific about this place. What is specific about Cornwall? And does that lead to a specific type of literature? And that's not just a Cornish question. I think that's a question that haunts studies of regional literatures generally, and those of us who are interested in place and spatiality. Is there something about a place that creates a specific type of narrative, and how can we investigate that relationship in productive ways? So I took my own very firm sense of identity as a Southeast Londoner, plunged into a very particular Cornwall, and I wanted to know more about how identities are formed and how they're shaped by storytelling. To me, the Gothic lends itself really naturally to this kind of inquiry. The Gothic is all about the fragile and non-existent lines between fiction and reality, where the real is actually more strange, more unbearable, more inarticulable than we could ever hope to imagine. Identity too is central to the Gothic. The dissolution of self as subject, severance from family and community, uncanny doubling, abjection, mistaken identity, all revolve around the difficulty of truly knowing oneself, or wondering whether there is a self or reality to even know in the first place. Problems of knowing, of ontology, phenomenology, epistemology haunt the Gothic and illustrate the ways in which the known, the real, the sure are just very fragile narratives, vulnerable to shocks and horrors, ready to shatter them into shards. With that in mind, I'm going to be, I'll just show you where I was. So if you look on this map here, there's Falmouth at the bottom. Penryn campus was just a little while inland. So there's a little map of Cornwall to give you a sense of the space that we're talking about. So that's the structure of Cornwall. Here's the structure of the paper. So I'm going to open with what is a Cornwall anyway, and I'll explain why that's the title of it. I'm going to talk to you about some Cornish Gothic texts that emerged across the 19th century. Try to work towards kind of defining a Cornish Gothic. Think about what's the point of doing all of this in the first place before branching out into how this could inspire or lay foundations for a coastal Gothic and a queer Gothic coastal framework. I'm really excited to hear your thoughts and questions and talk to you in breakout rooms as well. What is a Cornwall? So one of the first papers I ever gave internationally was in California, and I gave an entire 30-minute paper on the Cornish Gothic. And I said, any questions? And so I put up a hand and they said, what is a Cornwall? And that's when I realized that I needed to start with explaining what Cornwall is and where it is before I launch into my tirade about how it's represented in literary sources. And though I'm sure all of you know what a Cornwall is, it's worth reiterating some of the things that make it specific and particular, because these are going to help us when we're thinking about the different kinds of literatures it goes on to inspire. So it is a county in the southwest of England, so that's hotly contested. Many Cornish people consider themselves to be not English, which is crucial for us. It's a duchy. The only other one is the Duchy of Lancaster. It is surrounded on three sides by water, so often is imagined in sources as an island or an island populace. It's also fragmented into islands itself, so there are the Scilly Isles and Looe Island to the south of the county as well. So in many ways it's an archipelago off an archipelago, so we get the sense of atomization almost across the Atlantic. It has a very strong sense of historical independence and resistance to outsiders and outside administrative interference. It's conceived of as foreign from both within and without the county. So Curnow, where the word Cornwall comes from, literally translates as foreign horn in the sea. It suffered incredible economic decline from kind of the 1600s onwards, leaving people in desperate poverty. So poverty in Cornwall was compared to the Lancashire cotton famines, for example, and it is still the third poorest county in the north of Europe today. And part of this is because of the decline of the mining industry. Reliance upon mining, reliance on fishing, then and now on tourism. So it's a very seasonal economy to this day. The Cornish were granted minority status in 2014, so they were recognised as a distinct ethnic group, and the ethnographical research into the Cornish as racialised begins in the 19th century when my own research starts. it is still to this day difficult to access and traverse. So I'm sure those of you who have travelled to Cornwall are aware of this. I remember being on a overnight train to Cornwall, reading Thomas Hardy bemoaning 11 hours to get there from Paddington, while it was taking me 11 hours to get there from Paddington well over 100 years later. So it is represented often as impenetrable or unchartable, which ultimately means uncolonizable. One of Cornwall's proudest historical claims is that they were never invaded by the Romans, probably because the Romans found it too difficult to get through there on foot. The Cornish language is a dead language, so unlike Welsh, which had never died out, that has a lot of linguistic similarities to Cornish, the language officially died, meaning the last native speaker of Cornish died in the 18th century. Dolly Pentreath, who becomes a kind of folklore figure in herself. You can get little like magnets of her and porcelain figures of her in the 19th century into now. And it was the last county of England to be connected to the national rail network in the 1850s, significantly after the rest of the country was connected. So it is coming very late in the game in terms of mobility, accessibility, and an emerging tourist industry. It's also a saltwater county. Nowhere in Cornwall are you more than 17 miles by the sea. So it's profoundly shaped by its coast, cliffs, maritime trade and global encounters through its waterway. That is a summary of Cornwall. It also has lots of really weird and interesting links to Brittany, with the Cornish language sharing some similarities with Brittonic, and happy to talk about that more later if useful. In my early stages of my research, I was particularly struck by this passage from Robert Louis Stevenson, the Robert Louis Stevenson, A Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. When you first start looking for Gothic sources about things, you go to the big Gothic authors. I turned to Stevenson and I didn't expect to find any references to Cornwall, and I was stunned to come across this. This is a travel narrative published in 1909, where Stevenson reflects on the oddness of traveling through Australia and finding Cornish people. He thinks he's about as far away from his British homestead as is possible, and he comes upon a knot of Cornish miners. He describes how they kept grimly by themselves, discussing privately the secrets of their old world mysterious race. Lady Hester Stanhope believed she could make something great of the Cornish. For my part, I can make nothing of them at all. A division of races older and more original than that of Babel keeps this close esoteric family apart from the neighbouring Englishmen. Not even a Red Indian seems more foreign in my eyes. This is one of the lessons of travel, that some of the strangest races dwell next door to you at home. This passage opens my book because I think it is a perfect microcosm of everything people thought about Cornwall in the 19th century. It is a place that is represented as English and not English, a place that is represented as foreign, but a foreignness that is disturbingly close to home. So it's tapping into those anxieties about atavism and devolution and degeneration, and reverse colonization as well. So thinking about Stephen Biarata describing Dracula as a fear of the foreigner landing on British shores as a consequence or response to British imperial expansion. Cornwall then represents the foreigner that has always been there, lurking on the doorstep, suddenly having access through developing transportation technologies to England as a whole. We have the racialization of the Cornish, which is perpetuated through Gothic sources. Miners, for example, are perceived to have evolved to be shorter, to be able to see in the dark, incredibly monstrous representations of incredible physical strength, which explains the mining superiority of the Cornish. And there is a sense here as well of a developing Cornish diaspora as a result of deprivation. So about half of the male population of Cornwall leaves Cornwall in about a 10-year range in the 19th century, which is unimaginable. I'm always blown away by those statistics, and I've dug into them to see if to investigate the validity, and they hold water, but I can't begin to think of the sense of grief, loss, change, displacement of losing such a huge chunk of the population to go off and form communities elsewhere in order to support their families and sustain their families. And that leads to continuous representations of Cornwall as leaky or abject, for people kind of leaking out as well as people leaking in. So we get an instability of borders and boundaries that takes a really global dimension as antidote to the image of isolation and severance that is usually bestowed upon Cornwall due to its inaccessibility as a peninsula and an archipelago. But a lot of these representations of Cornwall exist in a kind of a binaristic framework, which I'll talk about in more detail later. So this is from a Cornish churchyard by the Severn Sea. So I don't just look at fiction written set in Cornwall. I'm also really interested in representations in travel narratives and periodicals and newspapers as well. So this is a description from a piece of travel writing from 1852, just to show you the consistency of these very particular images of Cornwall across the 19th century at large. Perhaps there is no county in all Great Britain less known to the bulk of even of the more intelligent portion of the community than Cornwall. Its geographical position has hitherto isolated it, and it will probably be very long ere railways introduce any material alteration either in the character of the people or in the aspect of the land. And this is really crucial because Cornwall is imagined as a preserved past. So the late addition of the rail network, and then how slow that rail network is, and even now travelling around Cornwall, once you get to Cornwall, the issue of getting around Cornwall is still really difficult. So Cornwall is seen as untouched, and as I'm sure you will all know, this has incredible relevance in the 19th century with a fear of the onslaught of modernity. So Cornwall becomes this place preserved in aesthetic, protected from the eroding, corrosive qualities of modernity, where vestiges of old world wonders can remain, and one could then go and encounter them. So the emerging tourism that fills the economic vacuum left by mining is very much motivated by kind of virtual or conceptual time travel. You can go back to see England as it was, and Cornwall often functions as a kind of Disneyland theme park of what England was, but is also a warning story. Because, you know, as Cornwall's mining economy is collapsing, England is enjoying the fruits of industrial revolution. So it becomes this warning story of being too heavily reliant upon industry and the consequences of the fallibility of that. So while England is seen as on the rise because of industry, Cornwall is falling, disintegrating because of that over-reliance. So there's lots of odd economic stuff happening here as well. Stedding expands upon this sense right into 1887 of the ancient nature of Cornwall. On whatever side you like to take it, the historic, the prehistoric, the natural, architectural, geological, ornithological, or on the side of its folklore, Christian or heathen, the place teems with subject matter that is curious as it is interesting. Cornwall is the nursery ground of the saints, the fabled land of lioness, the home of the giants, the haunt of fairies, pixies, mermaids, demons, and spectres. To speak of its natural aspects, its wild seaboard and frequent air of savagery, one is almost bound to use terms of fancy. And it's that nursery that fascinates me, the home, the idea that Cornwall is not just a place where these things are preserved, but a place from whence they come. So we almost, post-Darwin, have a sense of Cornwall being the primordial waters from which all humans and demons and spectres arose. This is the birthplace. This is the womb of everything frightening. And that idea of being bound to use terms of fancy as well, that there's inevitability to Gothic narratives of Cornwall, that there is no other vocabulary that one could use, that Gothic authors might not need to, you know, bend much of the reality of Cornwall in order to adapt it into a Gothic framework. It is already Gothic in itself. And I think a key part of what is attracting authors to the county at this time is that it is a place of contradiction. So I've discussed some of them in my little précis there, but it is described as technologically advanced and also backwards. So Daphne du Maurier famously said that the Cornish were using steam-powered technology when the rest of England was still tilling the earth with pickaxes, but they're also represented as backwards, savage barbarians. It's got associations with modernity because of mining and mining technology and advances, but it also has this note of barbarism. Civilized and uncivilized, a poetic people because of those romantic Celtic allusions, but also uncivilized, romantic and Gothic. One of my favorite speculative considerations is that Humphrey Davy invited Samuel Taylor Coleridge to Cornwall at the same time that Wordsworth invited him to the Lake District. So in an alternate universe somewhere, the entirety of British Romanticism is totally entrenched in Cornwall. That there is a place both attractive and repulsive. So tourists desperately want to get to this leisure location, while at the same time it's being represented as awful. So that constant Gothic tension of wanting to have proximity to that which is pushing us away. English and not English, very isolated and severed from the rest of the world, but also historically an internationally significant trading port. So it's thought to be the Cassiteride Isles of the ancient Phoenicians. It's beautiful, but it's also ugly. Lots of tourist writing from the 19th century describes disappointment at encountering the barren moors of Cornwall, while also, as we know from a quick Google, it's very beautiful. It's idyllic and full of monsters. It's religious and full of devils. It's newly discovered by this connection to the rail network, but it's also ancient. It's an ideal tourist destination that's being promoted across the century, but it's also hostile to strangers and outsiders. It's royalist, but it's ungovernable. The Cornish miners govern themselves, and riots are commonplace in Cornwall from the 18th century onwards. And it's central to the Industrial Revolution and forgotten. So the Industrial Revolution would never have happened in the UK as it did without the ore, minerals and mining technology from Cornwall. But it is frequently obfuscated and obliterated from these important narratives, which I find increasingly amazing. Now more people than ever are working on the Victorians, Industrial Revolution, extractivism. It seems to me that occluding Cornwall from that picture is a gap in our knowledge. So who is attracted by all this weird stuff? Everyone and their mother. It turns out when I started my PhD, I had 4 books written, Gothic books written about Cornwall. Now there are too many, and many more I keep discovering even now. Name a big Gothic author of the 19th century. They probably wrote about Cornwall in some way, shape or form, including Mary Elizabeth Braddon, Robert Louis Stevenson, Hardy, Wilkie Collins, Bram Stoker, Conan Doyle, Marjorie Williams, who wrote The Velveteen Rabbit before she delved into children's fiction, wrote chilling horror stories that were said to inspire H.P. Lovecraft. Sabine Baring-Gould, Robert Stephen Hawker, Alfred Lord Tennyson, set The Idylls of the King in Cornwall, which is the national epic that comes to define the Victorian period, and yet no one pays attention to the fact it's set in Cornwall, of all places. Algernon Charles Swinburne, F. Tennyson Jesse, who's a 20th century kind of noir writer and the niece of Tennyson, sets some very odd tales in Cornwall, one of which Gothic has shared with you on the website. Dinah Craik, Vernon Lee, maybe Charles Dickens. So there are some theories that in A Christmas Carol, when they are flying over land and see the smoking chimneys, some scholars claim that is them flying over Cornwall. And William Blake as well, there are arguments that Jerusalem is actually set in Cornwall, that the satanic mills are the mining chimneys, and that this is speaking to an ancient Cornish legend that the child Christ arrived in Cornwall with his uncle in pursuit of the finest tin in the world. So did these feet in ancient times walk upon Cornwall's grass is green? So it's an incredibly significant site in the wider literary imagination, and crucially provides a site for intellectual networks. So Tennyson, for example, comes to Cornwall specifically to seek out Robert Stephen Hawker, the antiquarian, folklorist, ghost story writer, for inspiration for Idylls. So these are people who are interacting with each other consistently. Thomas Hardy's Cornish Gothic novel, A Pair of Blue Eyes, was said to be Tennyson's favourite novel. So there is a circulation of Cornwall in the imaginary at this time. Vernon Lee specifically goes to Cornwall to seek out a Tennysonian Arthur, and is really disappointed by what she encounters there. But it's still haunted, it's just not what she expected. I'm happy to answer questions or talk about any of these authors or their texts in more detail as well. So why are all of these people thinking about Cornwall at this time? I've spent a lot of time talking about how Cornwall is forgotten and it's obfuscated and it's marginalised. So how are all of these people finding out enough about it? And why is it stimulating Gothic imaginary in particular? Print culture is always my go-to. People are reading about things and have access to things in different ways than they have before. Specifically, an explosion of travel guides and travel writing. So a lot of the Great Western Railway travel guides that are coming out specifically include Gothic narratives about Cornwall, so stories, or monstrous narratives about Cornwall, so stories about piskies, saints, giants, ghosts, demons, are used in promotional materials to invite people to come to the county. Imperial expansion and collapse across the 19th and 20th century also creates interest in this space so close to England that is conceived as not English. The rail network, collapse of the mining industry, rise of a tourist industry, birth of specifically a very literary tourism. So I'm thinking about the rise of the rail network in line with the rise of mass print culture, in line with the rise of literacy, and how all of these things become bound up in each other to create a kind of penny dreadful pulp fiction that is inescapable from increased mobility. Great Western Railway have a lot to answer for. They were not just creating promotional materials, but building hotels. And shipwrecks and maritime disaster trigger the popular imagination in huge ways. So much of the British economy is dependent upon maritime trade. Half the world's carrying capacity, I think in 1852, is British. And maritime disaster becomes very normal, but also very frightening. So, you know, newspapers increasingly had terrific tales of shipwreck and disaster. The Mary Celeste captures the popular imagination. The Flying Dutchman gains momentum because it was very likely that you and anyone you knew someone who had been involved in maritime disaster, and Cornwall was seen as a hotbed for it, surrounded on three sides by water with particularly deadly coasts. So this is another motivating factor behind Gothic authors thinking about the county. It becomes associated with King Arthur and thus ancientness, and specifically an ancient type of national identity through the Idylls of the King, through Tennyson. And people want to come to see the birthplace of this Arthurian figure. It also has beautiful landscape and seascape that are represented as foreign. So down here, I've got a little map from GWR that compares Cornwall to Italy. It's the Cornish Riviera. It has a Mediterranean climate. It's a kind of type of staycation kind of tourism. Why go abroad when you can enjoy England's own Mediterranean peninsula? And antiquarian activity as well, kind of as a response to the death of the Cornish language, increasing literacy rates elsewhere in the country, and this sense that Cornwall has somehow been preserved from modernity, meant that lots of antiquarian figures like William Bottrell and Robert Hunt descend upon Cornwall as an attempt to preserve its history in a really kind of paternalistic, authoritarian way. So Cornish stories start circulating rapidly. And even in Arthur Conan Doyle's Cornish Gothic short story, The Adventures of the Devil's Foot, Watson convinces Holmes to go to Cornwall for rest and recuperation, and Holmes agrees to, so that he can kind of perform these antiquarian activities and investigate Cornwall's barbarous Celtic histories. And he becomes obsessed with kind of finding arrowheads, flint arrowheads in the cliffs. And then obviously there's a deadly, terrible crime, the Cornish horror, which gets Holmes back in action and away from his out of office. And I think the main draw for me for my thesis is Cornish particularism. So, and as the world is becoming more complicated and bigger, and communication technologies and transport technologies and mass media and industrial capitalism and imperial expansion are making borders and boundaries and identity confusing more so than ever before. You know, the planet's older than anyone thought. Increased secularization is incredibly destabilizing. Humanity descended from monkeys. All of this leads to a very fragile sense of self as subject, and Cornish particularism, the sense of strength of Cornish identity, becomes incredibly appealing as a narrative of self. So very, very briefly, here's a summary of all of this. Very happy to send out slides to everyone. All of these things come to represent a particular type of Cornish Gothic. And why is this useful to study? I'll talk about this a little bit more, maybe later and maybe in breakout rooms. But I imagine quite a lot of us in this room are people who work in art and humanities, and are people who are always asked why, more so than other fields. We have to justify our existence, justify our slim pickings funding, justify why we do this particular thing in this particular climate. You know, what's the point of saying Cornwall is spooky? How's that going to help the world when we're plunging towards apocalypse? And I'm not going to pretend it is going to help the world, but I don't think everything does have to help the world. I think we're all playing our own tiny parts. But I study this, I continue to study this because Cornwall is still the third poorest county in Northern Europe. It was devastated by Brexit and COVID. It's still suffering the consequences of administrative neglect behind a veneer of touristic spit and polish. And I think the Gothic provides a framework for dismantling romantic notions of regional spaces. It illuminates the exploitation and lived horrors and work beneath sugared surfaces of romantic regionalism. We live in a time of horror, and the horrors expressed in Cornish Gothic around borders and boundaries and identity and transgression and environment and fear of the foreign, racialization, the absurdity of late stage capitalism. All these horrors are perhaps more true for us today than they were even in the 19th century. And we need to turn to these ideas with horror, with affect, with repulsion. But in summary, as Gothicists here in the room, I think we can agree that having an effective, repulsed, horrified attitude to what's happening to the world around us might be a way in to providing a framework, a methodology for cultural resistance, entrenched in centuries of violating the status quo to make space for the marginalised and the traumatised. It's not just ghosts, it's a screw you to the world, I think, is what the Gothic can hopefully offer us, and that Cornwall really becomes a microcosm of. So very quickly, as I want to make sure we have loads and loads of time for talking, I'll just propose briefly. Yep.
Yeah. Well, we can see the screen now. Great, perfect.
Lovely. I'll briefly propose what I'm beginning to think of as a queer Gothic ecology in really embryonic terms, because I'm kind of on a back foot here, because queer ecologies are very, very new, and eco-Gothic, Gothic ecologies, they're also still relatively new. New theorizations of the queer Gothic are coming along all the time. So we kind of have 3 points on this Venn diagram that we need to be engaging with. But I think that's incredibly exciting and productive. So for those who might not be aware, the queer ecology refers to a conceptual framework that investigates the relationship between the queer and the natural. It confronts the ways in which popular discourses posit the natural and the queer in opposition, and instead locates more complex entanglements. So it's about the relationship between environments and sexualities. It's about how we can queer our attitudes towards the environment in terms of thinking about the environment in non-normative ways that can reject white supremacist hegemonies, heteronormative ways of thinking, ableist ways of thinking, to imagine an alternate way of going about our relationship with the natural world. It's about a liberatory potential in recuperating a queer connection with nature. And really at its heart, it's about the natural, not versus the unnatural, but where those overlaps and complements exist as well. And to me, this means it's ours. This means it is Gothic territory, dealing with the natural, unnatural, supernatural, preternatural is a vocabulary I think we're probably all really comfortable with. So I think queer ecologies and Gothic studies are really natural bedfellows. And queer ecologies works in a number of different ways. Queer as a noun, in terms of kind of a queer ecological aesthetics, thinking about how human actors have a relationship with the environment, but also queering as a verb, as a way to think about the world in those non-normative terms. There's lots of engagement with scientific fields and communication in queer ecologies. So it's kind of starting out from a socio-political or a STEM foundation, and is only just in the 90s moving into arts and humanities as a field. It's about activism, but it's also about this wider biopolitical and post-human turn in cultural theory across the last 10, 15 years. And there are a number of critics who have been locating the queer ecologies of the coastline in particular in a modernist discourse. So people who have been doing fantastic work on Proust and Woolf, Carson, Beckett, D.H. Lawrence. This fantastic text only came out in March of this year. So this is Modernism at the Beach, Queer Ecologies in the Coastal Commons by Hannah Fried-Thal. And Fried-Thal describes some of the key features of the literary coast that lend it to these queer ecological imaginings. The coast is a protean borderland of blurred social categories and precarious self-presentation, where social categories are undone. It investigates the aesthetic possibilities inherent in mutability, skirting the sublime. It is an escape from city life, from reality, from social mores, the quotidian. It is colonized, engineered, artificial, fetishized, idealized, while remaining a ragged edge, a place of debris and leftovers and waste. It's a site of beginnings and endings, resisting the planned and orderly. That speaks to me as a Gothicist and seems to provide a potential here for a Gothic interrogation of the queer ecology of the coastline. But I want to know what happens when we move away from modernism towards the Gothic, and we move away from the 20th century towards the century that defined the emergence of the Great British Seaside Resort, seaside tourism, industrial capitalism, ecological anxiety, and increasingly public queer experience. What happens when we relocate these queer ecologies of the coastal common that Fried-Thal describes to the 18th and 19th century beach? Because I argue that there is a foundation for this significantly earlier than that in the coasts of Anne Radcliffe and Charlotte Smith and Mary Shelley, that's concretized by authors like Wilkie Collins and Thomas Hardy into the later part of the 19th century. We cannot separate the coast as a space of queer liberation from the foundations of the Victorian seaside town as motivated by leisure, labour, economics and class politics. And this is particularly visible at the Cornish coast as a microcosm of national anxieties surrounding economy, industry and identity. And I just have some examples for you here of texts that I think wrestle with a Gothic history of queer coasts, with Rebecca and Jamaica in and My Cousin Rachel being my obvious Cornish recommendations. But there is also a long and noble cinematic history of the queer Gothic coasts, or the queer coast more broadly, through The Lost Boys, Ammonite, Portrait of Lady on Fire, St Maud, Hannibal. And I think there's a very good argument to be made for Point Break as well. And what I'd really like to know as we go into these conversations that we're about to have, so I have some little extracts, but these are all available on the website, so don't worry about them too much, is whether a queer eco-Gothic could work, or whether I'm just having some kind of strange delusion in my from the mold in my office. Whether, like queer ecologies, the Gothic is concerned with unveiling imperialist and patriarchal and capitalist underpinnings of superstructures through an aesthetic, whether both are resistant and radical and born from revolution. Both are centered on a relationship between the natural and the unnatural, the denaturalized, the supernatural, the hyperreal. They offer a challenge to imperialist, enlightenment, realist epistemologies. They reconsider the irrational and irrational. There's space for the articulation of marginalized experiences. They're linked to fears over the toxic, decay and rot and decline, the unproductive. And throughout, there is a thread of transgression. a concern with history repeating itself. And let's see if this works. Yeah, can you think of any other examples of a coastal Gothic, the Cornish Gothic, the queer eco-Gothic, the queer coastal ecological Gothic? What significance do regional literatures have in the present? Is regionality becoming more contested, less contested, more visible, less visible? Can the Gothic help us move forwards politically, environmentally, aesthetically? Does it have to? Is this constant justifying of our field just a product of a wider attack on arts and hums? And are beaches gay? I think is the question that really keeps me up at night. Sorry for rushing through that really quickly. I was really thrown by my headset suddenly making the world horrifically silent. And I know there is so much more to say, and these are a lot of really big fields I'm trying to mush together really quickly. But thank you so much for listening to me ramble on. I'll end with a recommendation for Dracula's Nosferatu Beach Party, which I think more succinctly explains these entanglements in a way I never could. And I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions, and apologies to those of you who have seen fragments of this in other guises over the years.